Have you ever paused for a moment, really paused, to look at a flower that has withered? Not just glanced at it and tossed it aside, but truly looked at it. The petals no longer carry the glow of yesterday. The fragrance that once filled the air has faded. Its head bows, its colors dim, and what once drew admiration now seems to whisper quietly, almost painfully, about something we don't want to face. Most people turn away. We don't like to look at what is fading, what is dying, what is no longer useful. We prefer the bloom, the fullness, the moment of glory. But the withered flower holds a message that the blooming one cannot speak. And that message is silence. A silence that speaks louder than words. A silence that tells us everything changes. When we see a flower in full bloom, we celebrate its beauty, we take photos, we place it in a vase, we admire it. But in that very moment, we forget the truth. The bloom is already beginning to fade. It has begun its journey toward withering the moment it opened. This is not tragedy. This is life. Yet we live as though beauty should last forever, as though health should never decline, as though love should never shift, as though success should never fade. We cling to moments, trying desperately to stretch them beyond their natural course. And so, when change inevitably arrives, we suffer. The withered flower is a teacher. It does not shout. It does not demand our attention. It simply stands there, fragile, quiet, and honest, waiting for us to notice. If you dare to look closely, you will see yourself in it. Your childhood, once bright, has faded. Your youth, once bursting with color, is slowly changing. Your achievements, your possessions, even the people you love, each is a flower, blooming and fading in its own time. The withered flower is not there to depress you. It is there to awaken you, to remind you that beauty was never meant to be held, only appreciated in the moment it is given. Imagine for a second that you're holding a rose. Its petals are soft, its fragrance intoxicating. You hold it close, you want it to last, but even as you cherish it, the petals are already moving toward their fall. Now imagine a week later. The rose in your hand is dry. The petals crumble at your touch. What do you feel? Disappointment, sadness, a sense of loss. But what if, instead, you felt gratitude? Gratitude that it bloomed at all. Gratitude that you were there to witness its moment of beauty. Gratitude that you held it close, even knowing it would fade. This is the silent message of a withered flower. It whispers, everything you love will change. Everything you fear will change. Everything you are will change. So don't cling, cherish. There's a story told in Zen circles about a monk who spent hours tending a small garden. Every day he watered, cared for, and admired the flowers. But when they withered, he did not mourn. He simply bowed to them. One student asked him, "Master, why do you bow to a dead flower?" And the monk smiled and said, "Because it has fulfilled its nature perfectly." That is the heart of the lesson. A flower does not resist its fading. It does not complain. It does not cling to the summer sun. It simply lets go. And in letting go, it teaches us how to live. The truth is, we spend so much of our lives running from impermanence. We hide from the wrinkles on our skin. We dread the day our children grow and leave home. We fear the moment we lose what we've worked so hard to gain. But no matter how fast we run, impermanence is always there, walking quietly behind us, waiting to be acknowledged. The withered flower does not chase us. It doesn't need to. It just stands there, still and honest, saying, "See me and you will see yourself." This is why Buddhist teachings begin here, with impermanence, Anicca. Because until you see the truth of change, nothing else can be understood. The flower is not just a flower. It is the universe condensed into a single, delicate form. It is birth, growth, decay, and death, all in one cycle right before your eyes. And when you see that, truly see it, something shifts inside you. Your heart softens. Your grip loosens. Your fear begins to dissolve. You realize that to fight impermanence is like fighting the wind, but to flow with it is to be free. So the next time you walk past a withered flower, don't turn away. Don't dismiss it as useless. Pause, look closely, let it speak to you. Because in that fragile, fading form lies the most powerful lesson you will ever learn. That life is beautiful precisely because it does not last. That love is precious because it changes. That you are alive right now, in this fleeting moment, and that is enough. And if you can listen deeply to this silent message, then perhaps you will begin to notice impermanence not only in flowers, but in yourself, in the people around you, in the very rhythm of your days. And when you notice it, you will begin to live differently, not in fear, but in wonder. This is where our journey begins, with a single withered flower and the timeless truth it reveals. From here, the path opens wider. Each step we take will bring us closer to understanding how impermanence is not an enemy, but a teacher, not a loss, but a gift. And just as the flower bows to the earth, we too may learn to bow to life, in all its fleeting beauty. The withered flower whispers of change. But what exactly is this truth it carries? Why does Buddhism place so much emphasis on impermanence? To the Buddha, impermanence was not a hidden idea, it was the very heartbeat of reality. When he sat beneath the Bodhi tree and awakened, one of the first truths he realized was this: everything that arises will pass away. Nothing we touch, nothing we see, nothing we feel lasts forever. This truth is called anicca, impermanence, and it is one of the three marks of existence, alongside suffering dukkha and non-self anatta. To understand Buddhism, you must first look directly at anicca, because without it, life feels confusing, unfair, and filled with endless grasping. But with it, life begins to make sense. Think for a moment about your own body. From the day you were born, you have been changing. Cells divide, grow, die, and renew. You are not the same person you were 5 years ago, not even the same person you were yesterday. Every breath you take is a small birth and a small death. Inhale, life enters. Exhale, life leaves. Impermanence is not just something we observe in flowers or seasons. It is woven into our very skin, into our blood, into our breath. You are impermanence, walking, breathing, speaking. The Buddha once pointed to a stream to explain this truth. He said, "Just as a river flows, it is never the same from moment to moment. If you step into a stream today and step again tomorrow, it is not the same water. Yet we call it the river, as if it were fixed. Life is just like that river. We call it me, we call it mine, but from moment to moment it is changing. The body shifts, the mind shifts, emotions come and go. What you call yourself is not a solid rock, it is a flowing current. And yet, even knowing this, why do we suffer so deeply? Because we don't live as if it were true. We live as if beauty should last forever. We live as if health should never decline. We live as if relationships should never change. We live as if life itself should never end. But Buddhism teaches, suffering arises when we cling to what is changing as if it were unchanging. Imagine clinging to the petals of a flower, trying to tape them back on as they fall. Imagine trying to hold the sun in the sky, refusing to let it set. Imagine trying to stop your own reflection in the mirror from aging. It is a battle that cannot be won. The Buddha compared this clinging to a burning torch. If you hold it too tightly, you burn yourself. The flame is not wrong, it is simply what it is. The suffering comes from the way we hold it. This is the essence of dukkha, our refusal to accept anicca. But here is where the teaching becomes liberating. Impermanence is not only about loss, it is also about possibility. Because everything changes, suffering can change too. Because everything changes, mistakes can fade, wounds can heal, hearts can open again. Because everything changes, the person you were yesterday is not the person you have to be today. Impermanence is not a curse. It is the very reason freedom is possible. Think of a storm. When the clouds gather, when the rain falls, it may feel endless. But eventually the sky clears. Think of grief. When someone you love passes away, the sorrow can feel unbearable. But over time, like waves, it softens. Not because you forget, but because life continues to flow. Think of joy. When laughter fills the room, when your heart feels light, it doesn't last forever either. But does that make it less precious? Or does it make it more? If joy were permanent, we might take it for granted. But because it is fleeting, we treasure it. This is why monks often meditate on impermanence, even using corpses in charnel grounds to reflect on death. To some, this seems morbid, but to those who practice, it is a source of deep peace. Because when you realize that death is natural, that fading is natural, you stop resisting. You begin to live more fully, with more kindness, with more gratitude. In fact, one of the Buddha's last teachings to his disciples was simple yet profound. All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. He was reminding them, do not waste your life clinging to illusions. See the truth and lie awake. But let us return to the flower. The bloom and the wither are not separate. They are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other. To want the bloom without the wither is to want the impossible. And so, when you see a flower, you are not just seeing beauty, you are seeing its future, its fading, its end. But instead of despairing, you can learn to bow to it, to honor the fullness of its journey. This is the practice of mindfulness, to see impermanence not with fear but with reverence. Imagine if you lived your life this way. Every hug you give, you know it may be the last, so you hug more deeply. Every sunrise you see, you know it will never return, so you watch more carefully. Every conversation with someone you love, you know it is unique, so you listen with your whole heart. This is what Anicca gives us, not despair but presence, not hopelessness but appreciation. The nature of impermanence is not hidden in distant philosophies or abstract teachings. It is right here in the sound of your breath, in the falling of leaves, in the fading of flowers. And the more you see it, the more awake you become. Because to live without seeing impermanence is to live half asleep. But to live with it, to welcome it, is to step into a freedom that few ever taste. The withered flower has led us to the heart of the Buddha's teaching. Impermanence is not something to be feared, but something to be understood, embraced, even celebrated. And when we see how deeply impermanence flows through all of life, we begin to notice something else. That the flower is not just a flower, but a mirror reflecting our own fragile, beautiful existence. When we look at a flower, we don't just see a plant, we see a story that if we dare to look closely is not separate from our own. The flower begins as a seed, hidden in the soil, silent, unseen. It struggles in darkness, waiting for the right conditions, sunlight, rain, time. And then when the moment is right, it breaks through the ground. Isn't this how our lives begin too? We arrive in this world fragile, dependent, unseen by many. We take our first breath, our first cry, and slowly begin to grow. The bud emerges, small and closed, holding its promise inside. Just as we do in childhood, innocent, unformed, carrying potential. Then comes the bloom. The flower opens, revealing its colors, its fragrance, its full beauty. This is youth. This is the season when we shine, when the world notices us, when we feel alive and unstoppable. Our bodies are strong, our faces radiant, our dreams wide open. Like the flower in full bloom, we believe it will last forever. But the bloom is not the end of the story. Slowly, quietly, without warning, the petals begin to soften, to fade. The flower bends. The edges curl. The radiance changes. This is middle age, the passage of time written in the lines on our skin, in the changes in our bodies, in the shifting pace of our days. Just as the flower begins its return to the earth, we too begin to see that our time here is not infinite. And then the petals fall, the stem weakens, the fragrance disappears. What remains returns to the soil where it nourishes what will come after. This is old age, this is death. Not as an enemy, but as part of the same cycle that began with the seed. The flower is not destroyed, it is transformed. And so are we. When you see a flower, you are not just looking at beauty. You are looking at your own reflection. Your childhood is the bud. Your youth is the bloom. Your adulthood is the fading petal. Your old age is the falling stem. And your death is the return to the soil where life will rise again. The flower is a mirror, showing us our entire life in a single glance. There is a story told of a young prince who once walked through a royal garden. Surrounded by blossoms of every kind, he turned to his teacher and asked, "Why do flowers die? Why must beauty end?" The teacher picked up a withered blossom and said, "Because beauty is not separate from time. Without time, there is no bloom. Without bloom, there is no fading. Without fading, there is no renewal. The flower teaches you that life and death are not two but one." The prince was silent, and for the first time he understood his own reflection in the petals. This is why Buddhist monks often meditate on flowers, not because they are beautiful but because they are honest. When a monk sees a blooming lotus, he does not only see its radiance, he sees its impermanence. And when he sees a withered flower, he does not despair, he bows in gratitude, because the flower has shown him what it means to be human. Think about the photographs you keep. The ones from your childhood, your teenage years, your first love, your wedding, the birth of your child. Each picture is a bloom, a moment captured. And yet, when you look back, you realize that those moments are gone. You cannot step into them again. They are flowers that have already fallen. Does that make them meaningless, or does it make them precious beyond measure? It is because they have passed that you hold them so close to your heart. The flower also teaches us compassion. When we see a withered bloom, we don't judge it. We don't call it ugly. We simply know it is part of the cycle. But with people, we are less kind. We judge the wrinkles on a face, the weakness of old age, the decline of ability. We forget that this too is just a natural unfolding, as natural as the petals fall. To see a flower as a mirror is to see yourself and others with gentleness. To know that every stage, bud, bloom, fading, falling, is sacred. And perhaps this is why the Buddha once held up a single flower to his disciple, saying nothing. Only one disciple, Mahakasyapa, smiled. This was the famous flower sermon. The teaching was wordless but clear. Truth cannot always be spoken. Sometimes it must be seen directly in the simple unfolding of life. A flower in bloom, a flower withering, it is all the Dharma, the teaching itself. So the next time you pass by a blossom, don't just admire its color. See in it your own journey, your beginning, your peak, your decline, your return to the earth. And when you see a withered flower, don't turn away in sadness. Bow to it, for it has shown you the mirror of your own life. The flower is a mirror, yes, but if you look more deeply, you may notice another truth hiding there. It is not just about seeing our own reflection. It is about seeing the way we cling to that reflection, desperately trying to keep it from changing. And this leads us to a trap that so many of us fall into. If the flower is a mirror, then what it shows us is both beautiful and unsettling. Because when we look at its fading petals, something inside us resists. Something whispers, no, not yet, stay, don't go. This is the human heart caught in the trap of clinging. We love beauty, we adore the bloom. A young face, a strong body, the excitement of new love, the triumph of achievement. These moments shine like blossoms in the sun. And we want them to stay. But when beauty begins to fade, when success begins to slip away, when love begins to change, we panic. We grasp tighter as if our grip could stop the petals from falling. The Buddha once said, "The root of suffering is attachment." And nowhere is this more visible than in our clinging to permanence. Think of the way we fight time. We buy creams to erase wrinkles. We chase diets and surgeries to preserve youth. We cling to relationships long after their season has passed, terrified of being alone. We hoard wealth and possessions, hoping they will protect us from change. But no matter how tightly we hold on, time slips through our fingers like sand. This clinging is like trying to trap sunlight in a box. It warms us for a moment, but the more we try to keep it, the more frustrated we become when it disappears. There's a story of a king who loved roses more than anything. He ordered his gardeners to cut the blooms at their peak and lock them away in crystal chambers so they would never fade. At first, he was pleased, walking through rows of perfect roses. But soon he noticed something strange. The roses lost their fragrance, their life, their soul. What he tried to preserve became lifeless. The beauty he wanted to keep slipped away the moment he refused to let it change. We are not so different. In trying to hold on to what must pass, we strangle the very beauty we love. But why do we cling so fiercely? Because somewhere deep inside we believe that if things last, we will be safe. If beauty stays, we will be happy. If love never changes, we will never feel pain. If success never fades, we will never face failure. We confuse permanence with security. But the truth is harsher and more liberating. Permanence does not exist. What exists is the flow, the arising, the passing, the constant unfolding. Think about the people you once knew. Friends from childhood, teachers who guided you, maybe even loves you thought would last forever. Where are they now? Some are gone, some have drifted, some are memories you revisit only in dreams. And think about yourself. The person you were 10 years ago, do they still exist? Your face is different, your thoughts have changed, even your values may have shifted. The self you cling to is already gone. Yet we resist this truth. We cling to an identity, to a body, to a role, to a season of life, as if freezing it could make it eternal. But eternity, in that sense, is an illusion. The Buddha compared clinging to holding a torch with the flame pointing downward. The harder you grip, the more quickly you burn yourself. Clinging is not love. Clinging is fear disguised as love. When you cling to beauty, you don't actually love beauty, you fear losing it. When you cling to a person, you don't fully love them, you fear the day they might leave. When you cling to your success, you don't enjoy it, you fear the moment it disappears. In this way, clinging poisons what is otherwise pure. But let's pause here, because this might sound heavy, even hopeless. If everything fades, what are we supposed to do? Stop loving, stop caring, stop enjoying? No, the flower does not teach us to stop loving. It teaches us to love more deeply. To love a rose is not to tape its petals so they never fall. To love a rose is to breathe in its fragrance today, knowing it won't be here tomorrow. To love a person is not to chain them so they never change. It is to walk with them through change, to embrace the seasons of their being. True love is not clinging. True love is presence. There's a Zen saying, let go or be dragged. When you cling, you are dragged by time, kicking and screaming as it carries you forward. But when you let go, you walk with time. You flow with it. You dance with it. The flower is still beautiful even as it fades. But if you cling to its bloom, you miss the beauty of its fall. This is why impermanence, though unsettling, is also a gift. Without it, nothing new could arise. Without the fading of blossoms, no new buds could bloom. Without the passing of youth, there would be no wisdom of age. Without death, there would be no room for new life. Clinging blinds us to this. It tells us only of loss, never of renewal. It tells us only of fear, never of possibility. But if we loosen our grip, if we allow change to be what it is, we begin to see something else: freedom. And this freedom does not mean indifference. It does not mean cold detachment. It means the ability to hold life gently, fully, without crushing it in our grasp. Imagine holding a butterfly in your hand. If you squeeze too tightly, you kill it. But if you open your palm, it rests there freely, its wings brushing against your skin. That is love without clinging. The flower teaches us this lesson too. To appreciate beauty without demanding it stay. To embrace love without chaining it. To walk through life open-handed, rather than clutching desperately at what cannot be held. And so, the trap of clinging is not about the flower, it is about us. About how we relate to beauty, to time, to the people and things we love. The flower fades, yes, but in its fading it offers us a choice. Will we suffer by clinging, or will we awaken by letting go? This choice is where peace begins. And when you begin to loosen your grip, when you begin to let go, something remarkable happens. What once brought you pain begins to bring you peace. What once made you afraid begins to set you free. Because the art of letting go is not about loss. It is about discovering a new way of living. There comes a moment when clinging becomes too heavy. When the constant fight against change leaves us exhausted, like a traveler carrying stones in a bag that only grows heavier with every step. And then, almost like the release of a long breath, we let go. That moment is not a loss. It is a homecoming. Think about the times in your life when you finally released what you were holding too tightly. A relationship that had already ended long before you admitted it. A dream that no longer matched who you had become. A possession you thought you couldn't live without. The first moment of letting go feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. Fear rises in your chest. Your mind screams, what will I be without this? Who am I if I no longer hold on? But then, slowly, the fear shifts, the storm quiets, and you discover a surprising calm, as if the weight you carried was never truly yours to bear. The Buddha compared this to dropping a burning coal. Imagine clutching fire, insisting it is yours even as it scorches your skin. Letting go does not hurt, it is the holding on that burns. When you release, the wound can finally heal, but letting go does not mean rejection. It does not mean cold indifference or pushing life away. To let go is not to stop loving. It is to love more deeply without chains, like watching a sunset. You don't demand the sun to freeze in the sky. You simply watch it descend, each moment more precious because you know it will pass. To let go is to experience beauty in its fullness, unclouded by fear. There's a story of a monk who carried a bowl made of crystal. He admired its clarity, its sparkle in the sunlight. But he always told his students, "This bowl is already broken." At first, the students were confused. The bowl looked perfect without a single crack. But the monk smiled, explaining, "Because I see it as already broken, I can enjoy it fully now. I am not afraid of the day it slips from my hand. Every time I drink from it, I am grateful. When it finally shatters, I will smile because I have already let it go." This is the peace of letting go, not denial but acceptance. Imagine how different life would feel if you approached it this way. If every hug was embraced as if it might be the last. If every laugh was heard as if it were a fleeting gift. If every morning was welcomed as a blessing, not a guarantee. Wouldn't life feel more alive, more sacred, more free? The peace of letting go is not something distant. It is available here now. It begins with a shift in the heart, a willingness to say, "I allow this to be what it is. I release the demand for it to be forever." It's like opening the windows of a dusty room. Fresh air flows in. Light fills the space. What once felt suffocating becomes spacious and alive. And when you let go, gratitude naturally blossoms. Instead of saying, "Why didn't it last?" you say, "How lucky I was to have it at all." Instead of clinging to yesterday, you bow to today. Instead of fearing tomorrow, you welcome its mystery. This gratitude is not forced. It arises on its own, the way flowers bloom when spring arrives. But perhaps the greatest gift of letting go is the discovery of yourself beyond clinging. When you stop grasping at beauty, you begin to see beauty everywhere, not only in the bloom, but in the fall of petals, in the silence after laughter, in the spaces between breaths. When you stop clinging to relationships, you begin to love people for who they are, not for what they give you or how long they stay. When you stop clinging to life as if it were permanent, you begin to live with a deeper courage, a deeper joy, a deeper peace. Letting go is not the end of love. It is the beginning of freedom. And this freedom is not a cold emptiness. It is warmth, openness, a heart wide enough to hold the world without fear. The flower that withers is not a tragedy. It is a teacher whispering, "Release and you will be free." And when peace arises from letting go, something extraordinary happens. We no longer see impermanence as a threat. We see it as the very rhythm of life, a rhythm that can be trusted, a rhythm that can be loved, a rhythm that, when embraced, carries us to wisdom. Because once peace is found in letting go, we begin to notice that impermanence doesn't only reveal loss, it reveals something else too. It reveals renewal. In Zen, impermanence is not a problem to be solved. It is not a wound to be healed. It is the very heartbeat of existence. The masters of Zen never asked, "How can we escape impermanence?" Instead, they bowed to it. They treated it as the most intimate truth, closer than breath, closer than thought, closer even than the self we believe we are. There is a famous Zen saying, "The flower falls even though we love it. The weed grows even though we dislike it." In these simple words, a whole universe unfolds. The world does not bend to our desires. Beauty fades even when we cling to it. Unwanted changes arrive even when we resist them. And yet in this dance of arrival and departure, there is a strange and subtle beauty, because life is not under our control. Life is free. Zen practice invites us to look at impermanence not with sorrow but with presence. To see that in the falling of a petal there is no tragedy, only truth. In the passing of a moment there is no theft, only transformation. What disappears in one breath gives birth to the next. A Zen master once held up a teacup before his students. "To me," he said, "this cup is already broken. Because I know it will shatter one day, I can enjoy it fully now. I drink from it, I admire it, I care for it. And when it breaks, I will say, of course." This is the Zen way, to hold life tenderly, fully aware of its fragility, and therefore able to love it completely. In Zen gardens, impermanence is not hidden, it is celebrated. Stones are placed where moss will slowly grow. Sand is raked in patterns that the wind will soon erase. Blossoms are planted knowing they will scatter in spring breezes. Why? Because the beauty is not in resisting change. The beauty is in watching it happen. The falling leaf is no less sacred than the blooming flower. The silence after the bell is no less holy than the sound itself. Zen poems often capture this truth with just a few brushstrokes of words. One haiku says, "The temple bell stops, but the sound keeps echoing through the flowers." Impermanence here is not an end. It is a continuation, an echo, a gentle ripple moving through all things. The Zen masters saw impermanence as the doorway to awakening. Because if everything changes, then the self we cling to is also changing. If the self is not fixed, then what are we? Who are we? This question does not lead to despair. It leads to liberation. When you realize the you of yesterday has already passed, and the you of tomorrow has not yet been born, you begin to taste the freedom of this very moment. Here, now, alive. To see impermanence clearly is to live like a traveler walking barefoot in morning dew. Each step is fresh. Each breath is unrepeatable. Each sound, each sight, each touch is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. This is what Zen calls beginner's mind, the capacity to meet each moment as if it were the first and the last. But Zen also warns, if we turn impermanence into an idea only, we miss it. To think about impermanence is not enough. We must see it, taste it, breathe it. Sit quietly and watch your breath. Notice how it comes, stays for a moment, then disappears. Another arises, another fades. This is impermanence, intimate and alive, happening within you. Drink tea and notice how the warmth fills your mouth, then vanishes. Walk through a garden and notice how the blossoms open and scatter. Nothing stays, and yet everything is complete. In this way, Zen transforms impermanence from a source of suffering into a source of wonder. Because when you stop demanding the world to last, you can finally meet it as it is. And when you meet it as it is, you realize something extraordinary. Impermanence is not against you. It is you. You are the river that flows, the breath that rises and falls, the flower that blooms and fades. Impermanence is not a visitor, it is your very nature. And once you see impermanence with this clarity, fear begins to dissolve. Loss does not feel like a punishment. Change does not feel like betrayal. Instead, everything becomes part of a vast, seamless unfolding. The flower withers, yes, but in its withering, it returns to the soil which nourishes the next bloom. Nothing is lost. Nothing is wasted. It is all transformation. It is all life. And from this vision, another realization begins to bloom. If impermanence is the nature of all things, then every ending is also a beginning. Every death is also a birth. Every silence hides a hidden song. This is the deeper gift of impermanence, renewal. Love is perhaps where impermanence cuts the deepest. We meet someone and it feels like spring has entered our lives. Their smile, their presence, their very existence makes the world bloom. We tell ourselves, let this last forever. But love, like the flower, has its seasons. It grows, it changes, it sometimes fades. And if we don't understand impermanence, love can turn from a source of joy into a source of endless pain. The truth is, every relationship is a dance with time. A parent watches a child grow. Each stage, those first steps, the first day of school, the teenage years, arrives and then dissolves, never to return. If the parent clings only to the memory of the baby in their arms, they miss the beauty of the young adult standing before them. Two lovers fall in love. In the beginning, every glance feels electric, every word a song. But over time, the energy shifts. The passion matures, the spark transforms into something quieter, steadier. If one partner clings to the fire of the beginning, they may miss the warmth of what it has become. Friends too, people who once seemed inseparable, sometimes drift apart. Lives change, paths diverge. To cling to the old form of the relationship is to suffer. But to accept its transformation is to allow love to take a new shape, even if it is only in memory. Impermanence in love is not a curse. It is the very thing that makes love precious. Because the people we love will not always be with us, every hug matters. Every I love you matters. Every shared meal, every moment of laughter, every quiet silence side by side matters. It is impermanence that makes these moments shine. The Buddha compared human relationships to two logs drifting in a river. For a while, they float side by side, touching, journeying together. But eventually, currents shift and they separate, each carried toward its own destination. If we demand the logs stay together forever, we fight the river. If we accept the river's flow, we can cherish the time they drifted as one. Think of the times you resisted change in a relationship. Perhaps you tried to hold on to someone who was ready to leave, or you wished desperately that someone you loved would never age, never fall ill, never die. The pain you felt came not only from love, but from the refusal to accept impermanence. And yet, the most profound love is the one that embraces change, that bows to the truth of passing time. A Zen master once said, "When you love someone, remember they are already passing away. That way, every time you see them, it is like the last time." This may sound sorrowful, but in fact, it awakens the deepest tenderness. If you knew today were the last day with someone you love, how would you treat them? Would you argue over small things? Would you withhold your affection? Or would you look into their eyes, grateful just to be near them? Impermanence teaches us to love like that, not tomorrow, not someday, but now. It also teaches us to release when it is time. Sometimes love changes form. A romance becomes a friendship becomes a memory, a life shared becomes a life remembered. To cling to what was is to turn love into suffering. To honor what was and release it when its season has passed is to keep love alive in its purest form. And perhaps the greatest teaching is this: impermanence reveals that love is not about possession. You cannot own a person. You cannot freeze them in time. To love someone is to let them be as they are and to walk with them while paths align. When paths part, the love you shared does not vanish. It transforms into gratitude, into wisdom, into the tender ache of memory. So do not fear impermanence in love. Let it be your teacher. Let it remind you that every goodbye makes each hello more meaningful. Let it teach you to say, "I love you" without delay, to forgive without waiting, to hold someone close without assuming tomorrow will come. Because in the end, love is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it is lived. And when we see impermanence in love not as a thief but as a guide, something beautiful unfolds. Our hearts open wider, our compassion deepens. Our ability to truly be present with those we love becomes limitless. And from this openness, another truth emerges. Impermanence is not only a teacher of love, but also a teacher of compassion. In love and relationships, impermanence softens the heart. But when it comes to success, wealth, and fame, impermanence exposes the illusions we often mistake for security. We chase achievements as if they will shield us from the passing of time. We hoard riches as if gold could stop the turning of seasons. We hunger for recognition, believing applause can fill the silence of impermanence. But no matter how high we climb, how much we gather, or how loudly the world praises our name, time whispers the same truth: this too shall pass. History is filled with empires that once shook the earth, now reduced to ruins. Kings who once ruled continents are now names carved in stone. Celebrities adored in one decade vanish into obscurity in the next. Wealth dissolves with economic shifts. Fame fades as new voices rise. Even great success, once dazzling, becomes yesterday's news. Impermanence does not discriminate. It comes for the beggar and the billionaire alike. But the trap is not in achieving or in enjoying success. The trap is in clinging, believing that because we hold it now, we will hold it forever. Think of the businessman who spends his entire life chasing wealth. He accumulates fortunes beyond measure, but when death arrives, not a single coin can be carried with him. The wealth remains, but the hands that clutched it turn to dust. Think of the artist who tastes fame. Applause surrounds them, lights follow them, voices chant their name. But when trends shift, when youth fades, when new stars emerge, the world looks away. If their happiness depended on the crowd, what remains when the crowd is gone? The Buddha once told the story of a man who received a golden chariot. At first, he was overwhelmed with pride. He polished it, admired it, rode it through villages so everyone could see his fortune. But the wheels wore down, the shine dulled. Eventually, the chariot broke apart. The man sat weeping in the dust, not because he had lost a vehicle, but because he had tied his identity to something destined to decay. This is what happens when we confuse wealth, success, or fame with who we are. We forget that these things are guests, not permanent residents. Yet impermanence here is not an enemy. It is a reminder of where real value lies. Wealth can vanish, but generosity leaves a legacy that endures. Fame fades, but kindness lingers in the hearts of those you've touched. Success may be temporary, but wisdom shapes generations. The outer forms pass, but the inner qualities echo beyond the limits of time. Zen reminds us, fame and profit are like dew on the grass. When the sun rises, they vanish. This is not said to dismiss success or wealth, but to free us from being enslaved by them. Because when you know they are temporary, you can enjoy them without fear, use them without clinging, and let them go without regret. Imagine holding success like you would hold a flower. Admire its beauty, take in its fragrance, be grateful for the joy it brings, but do not demand it last forever. When its petals fall, bow in gratitude and step into the next season with open hands. In this way, impermanence transforms ambition into service, wealth into generosity, fame into humility. Ask yourself, what are you building that time cannot destroy? Not the fortune in your bank, not the followers who cheer your name, but the love you've shared, the lives you've touched, the compassion you've lived. These are not immune to impermanence, but they ripple beyond your lifetime, carried in ways you cannot see. So the flower withers, the applause quiets, the gold tarnishes. And yet in their fading they reveal a deeper wealth, a success untouched by time, the wealth of a liberated heart, the success of living in truth, the fame of being remembered not for what you owned, but for how you loved. And once you see impermanence in success, wealth, and fame, the question naturally arises, if all outer achievements fade, where should we turn for true freedom? This question leads us closer to the heart of wisdom, where impermanence itself becomes the teacher of awakening. If impermanence is the nature of all things, then mindfulness is the art of living in harmony with it. Mindfulness does not try to resist change. It does not demand life to be different. Instead, it opens the heart and says, "This is here, this is now, this is enough." Through mindfulness, impermanence stops being a threat and becomes a teacher. Every breath you take is a lesson. The inhale rises, fills you, then must be released. If you try to cling to the inhale, you suffocate. The exhale is not a loss. It is what allows life to continue. In this simple act of breathing, impermanence is revealed. Each breath is born, each breath dies, and yet together they sustain you. To practice mindfulness is to live like this, with eyes open to the fleeting nature of everything. Sip tea and feel its warmth before it fades. Listen to laughter and notice the silence that follows. Look at a loved one and treasure their presence, knowing it will not last forever. This does not make life heavy. It makes it radiant. Because when you know the moment will pass, you finally give yourself fully to it. The Buddha once told his disciples, "Consider the morning star, the dew drop, the flash of lightning, the candle flame, all things are like this." He was not warning them of doom. He was urging them to wake up, to see that the fragility of life is what makes it so precious. Mindfulness of impermanence can be practiced anywhere. When you watch a flower bloom and wither, when you notice your own thoughts arising and fading, when you see anger flare up, then soften, then disappear like smoke. Nothing lasts, not even suffering, and this realization plants seeds of peace. There is a Zen practice of listening to the rain. The master instructs, don't just hear the sound, listen to its impermanence. Every drop is unique. Every moment of rain will never come again. The rain becomes a meditation, each drop reminding you this moment is unrepeatable. Mindfulness also means being aware of how clinging makes impermanence painful. Notice when you feel frustration because things change. Notice when you grasp at pleasure, when you resist endings, when you fear the future. These are signs of holding too tightly. Then gently, with compassion, remind yourself, this too will pass. Let me be here while it is here. Through this practice, you begin to see the impermanence of not only things around you, but also yourself. Your thoughts change, your emotions change. The you that existed yesterday is gone. The you that will exist tomorrow has not yet arrived. What exists is only this breath, this heartbeat, this awareness. And in realizing this, the weight of the self softens. Life feels lighter, freer. Imagine living every day with this awareness. Waking up with gratitude because you know this sunrise will never happen again. Speaking with kindness because you know this conversation will not repeat. Loving deeply because you know this embrace is unique in the universe. This is mindfulness through impermanence, not an escape from life, but a deeper entry into it. And as this practice deepens, impermanence no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a friend always reminding you, don't miss this, don't wait, live now. And when mindfulness reveals the gift of impermanence, something profound awakens within. A quiet wisdom, a steady peace, a heart unafraid of change. Which brings us to the final reflection, how all these lessons of the withered flower, of impermanence in love, in success, in every breath, come together in one timeless truth, the freedom of acceptance. The journey of a flower from seed to bloom to withering is also the journey of life. And as we reach this final chapter, we return to the silent teacher who started it all, the withered flower. It speaks not with words but with presence, not with commands but with revelation, and its teaching is eternal. The flower whispers a truth older than time itself. All things arise, all things pass. At first we may resist this. We cling, we fight, we hope to stop its lessons from reaching us. But the longer we observe, the more we understand. Impermanence is not cruel. It is the pulse of life, the rhythm that allows everything to exist at all. Without the bloom, the withering would have no meaning. Without beginnings, endings would not teach. Without loss, gratitude could not arise. Every withered petal, every faded leaf, every moment that slips through our fingers is a teacher, a mirror, a doorway. It teaches patience, to witness change without panic. It teaches compassion, to hold life and others gently without grasping. It teaches wisdom, to see the fleeting nature of all things and find freedom within it. The withered flower also teaches courage. It asks us to let go of illusions of permanence, to release the need to control what cannot be controlled, to accept endings without despair and beginnings without fear. It shows us that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived fully, moment by moment. Think of every flower you have ever seen fade. Each one held a lesson, a reminder that life is transient, fragile, beautiful. Each one invited you to awaken, to notice, to embrace. And if you carry this awareness, you carry the flower with you always. Not as a symbol of sorrow, but as a beacon of wisdom. The Buddha held up a single flower in silence, and one disciple understood. That silent recognition, wordless and profound, is the essence of this teaching. Sometimes words cannot capture the truth. Sometimes a single moment of seeing, really seeing, is enough to awaken the heart. The withered flower asks only that we look, and in looking we learn. So let us bow to impermanence. Let us bow to love, to loss, to laughter, to pain, to life itself. Let us hold each moment as a gift, not as a possession. Let us breathe with awareness, walk with presence, and love with an open hand. The flower has withered, yes, but its teaching is eternal. Its fragrance lingers in memory, in awareness, in the quiet space between breaths. And now, as we close this journey, remember, the flower's life, though brief, was enough. Its bloom, its fall, its return to the soil complete. We too can live in this way, fully, freely, mindful of the fleeting, yet awake to the eternal. Because life, like the withered flower, is a lesson, a mirror, a teacher, a gift. May we carry its teaching into every moment, into every breath, into every step. And in doing so, may we discover peace, wisdom, and the quiet joy of simply being. The flower is gone, yet its truth remains, eternal. If this teaching of the withered flower touched your heart, take a moment to breathe it in and carry it with you. And if you wish to explore more timeless wisdom from the Buddha, to find peace in impermanence, and to awaken deeper mindfulness in your daily life, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, every video is a quiet invitation to reflect, to grow, and to live fully in each fleeting moment. Click subscribe and let the journey continue, one mindful breath at a time.